Great, so we'll go ahead and begin. I do want to welcome everyone to the space. You're very welcome. And I want to thank you all for taking the time this morning to join us for this conversation confronting anti-Asian racism in the settlement sector. Again, this is a second session or session actually of the webinar series, Racial Equity from Intention to Action, hosted by OCASI. Good morning to everyone. So to begin, I do want to introduce myself. So hello, everyone. My name is Asha Edwin, and I am an EDIR educator, researcher, and strategist working in community engagement, wellness, and change management. I am honored to be here in conversation with you all as we move into the second of 3 conversations, looking at how to move from intention to action in addressing racial equity in the immigrant and refugee-serving sector. Hello, everyone. So before we begin, I invite folks to check in with themselves and their surroundings, set the tone for the space and yourself. Notice any support that will assist you during today's conversation, including closed captioning, ASL interpretation, and French translation, or it may be simply acknowledging how you're arriving in the space today. So to begin the session agenda, I do want to go over this with you all. So we'll have a welcome, including a land acknowledgement. The speaker, Amy Go, who we are very excited to have share the presentation or lead the conversation on anti-Asian racism. We'll have a 5-minute wellness break following Amy's presentation and a Q&A discussion. So in creating a community space keeping, similar to housekeeping, I will mention that the session is recorded as I move into the conversation. So if you are not comfortable with being on camera, feel free to turn your cameras off. So this is a community space, and we want to encourage a healthy space for everyone. So we want to ask that you respect how you're arriving today, similarly, how others are showing up in this space, recognizing how our individual experiences impact and inform how we engage with and respond to different conversations. Comfort and choice. We ask that you mute your mics during the presentation. We will lead into a Q&A following the discussion. And so at that point, if you do wish to communicate verbally, you have the option to unmute yourself. Our space is your space, and the choice is yours to keep your camera off or on. Questions and conversations. We ask that you please use the chat to connect with us or post your questions throughout the session. During the Q&A, you have the option, of course, to feel free to use the raise a hand function, and we will call on folks as we move through the discussion period. So we'll move into the land acknowledgement. As we prepare for a conversation on racial equity and mobilizing inaction to action, I take this moment to recognize those who came before me. The land where I live and work is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee people. I extend reverence to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who live, love, and care for these lands today and continue to fight for their right to justice and recognition. In reconciliation, we find ourselves propelled with the ability to connect and understand that we must not only imagine a more equitable world, but actively participate in creating one. Today's session will look at community responses to anti-Asian racism amid confronting COVID virus and beyond. Amy highlights the year of the tiger in the lunar calendar, symbolizing strength and courage. During this session, we will begin to consider what it will take to combat the virus of racism, including rising anti-Asian racism in the settlement sector and Canada more widely. Within the context of the work we have done and continue to do in the sector, we use this as a reminder and call to action to maintain urgency in pursuing social justice and anti-racism. We dedicate this space to reflect on past and recent events of hate, discrimination, and racism, where hope may be lost and has the opportunity to be found. For today, I pose a guiding question, and it is, what strength or courage do you need to take as an individual or organization to combat the virus of racism? I invite you to personally reflect on this question as we move through the presentation and into discussion. I hope that this will offer everyone the opportunity to listen, learn, and reflect on how we contribute to enacting change in our organizations and our communities. And with that, I am excited to introduce Amy Go. Amy Go is the president of the Chinese National Council for Social Justice. A social worker by training, Amy has dedicated her professional career to serving immigrants and seniors and promoting and advocating for culturally and linguistically appropriate care and health equity for racialized communities. Amy currently provides consulting services to facilitate organizational strategic development, program planning, review, and anti-racism and anti-oppression organizational change. Thank you all, and we look forward to Amy's presentation.
Thank you so much, OCASI, Asha, for that very kind introduction. And I truly am honored to be here today to speak to OCASI members and partners again. And it's like coming home. Let me just begin by saying, after my MSW program, I started my job at OCASI, facilitating, coordinating the first policy conference for OCASI. And on the day of the conference, there was a fire on the conference site. Last minute, we had to move. And imagine me just graduated from school. It was a traumatizing experience, but totally enriching. The conversation was amazing. And OCASI has always been in my heart, even though if I'm not in the sector, I have, and I'm truly, truly privileged to continue to work with OCASI as part of the social justice movement advocacy group. So I'm going to share screen here. Hopefully it works. So as Asha said, my presentation is going to speak to anti-Asian racism. And since Asha has already started the land acknowledgement, I just also want to echo that and the commitment to truth and reconciliation. At the same time, I actually want to say that we are particularly grateful as Chinese Canadians to the Indigenous communities. And you will learn a little bit more about that. After the Chinese railway workers built the railway, they were kicked out, they were shunned, and they were basically banned by Canada. And it was the Indigenous communities along, particularly in the West Coast, that took the Chinese laborers in and welcomed them and embraced them. So I'm forever indebted and grateful to the Indigenous communities for opening their arms and their heart to these Chinese labor. At the same time, of course, through the years, to welcome immigrants like me and other settlers to Canada. So thank you. So I'm going to cover just a little bit about what CCN-CSJ is all about, and talk a little bit about this Hollywood version of Enter the Dragon image, and the history of anti-Asian racism and the realities of anti-Asian racism. And I will end with a video, and then let's engage in a conversation about what we should do and what we plan to do together to combat anti-Asian racism and anti-racism in general. So CCNC actually was incorporated in August 2019. our business name is CCNCSJ because we want to emphasize our focus on social justice. And the reason why we start incorporated again was to ensure the voices of Chinese Canadian communities in social justice and advocacy movements are heard. And our mission is to educate, engage, and advocate for justice and equity for all. There was a CCNC incorporated in the year 1980. And in fact, I was part of the initial CCNC. That was formed in response to a racist portrayal by CTV on a program called W5. And the segment was called Campus Giveaway, that portrayed Chinese students or Chinese-looking students to be foreigners, taking away spaces from Canadian students, white women, no doubt. And all these Chinese faces on that program were in fact either landed immigrants, permanent residents, or Canadian citizens. The schools that they show on that segment was U of T, and they were dentistry, pharmacy, medicine. And in fact, still up to now, those professional schools do not take a large number of foreign international students. Overwhelming majority of the students, even now, are Canadian citizens or permanent residents. So just because they look Chinese, they were deemed foreigners, taking away from white people. So in response to that outcry from the country, including the pioneers of CCNC leaders who protested and resulted in the apology from CTV. And as a result, there was a recognition of a need to build a national movement to speak up against anti-Chinese, anti-Asian, and anti-racism in general. Unfortunately, CCNC, this earlier version was deactivated years later. And so that's why a group of us who were involved in the early CCNC came together again. So Enter the Tiger, as Asha said, this is the Lunar New Year of the Tiger. It started February 1st, 2022 in the Julian calendar. And Lunar New Year is based on the cycle of the moon, right? So this is the first moon of the new calendar. And the origin of Lunar New Year was that, that thousands of years ago in China, so there was this Jade Emperor who challenged all the animals in the kingdom to a race. And then, so all these animals raced that, and don't forget, there was no tiger there was no lion in China, so only tiger. So, and all these animals are raced, and tiger came in third. Rat came in first. So tiger symbolizes courage, ambition, generosity, and the drive to help others. And so it really does symbolize resilience, strength, and courage. And in the year of the 2 years of pandemic, definitely, I think the resilience of the communities, not only Chinese Canadian, but the whole, Canadian communities has been shown, and the strength and courage of all have definitely been demonstrated. However, of course, the virus of racism is very, very much alive and well. Another story, this just happened right at the Lunar New Year, we just welcomed the year of the tiger. And so we have this Enter the Dragon version of Hollywood, of the white society. So every Lunar New Year, we would give out red packets, and inside we would put money. And this was an expression of best wishes, to wish the recipients health, prosperity, growth, and luck. And it's very much a symbol of well wishes, good wishes. Versus, if you see on the other side, these are red packets filled with JAWS money. This was distributed at the U of T graduate house around the Lunar New Year. And inside this JAWS money, actually, it says prominently in English, says hell money. And definitely, even if you don't know, if you know nothing about Chinese red packets, one would question why you would put hell money in red packet. And this hell money, what in some traditions, in some families, and some in some tradition, Chinese would burn this JAWS money in funerals or death anniversaries for their deceased loved ones. And we do that, in for my late parents, my grandparents, and during their death anniversaries. And this is for them to use wherever they are in the afterworld. And so this is not to be given to people who you want to express well wishes to. And so the Chinese students in U of T, and you can imagine now, U of T, in fact, I was told the largest group of international students at U of T are from China. And also there is a significant proportion of the student population of Chinese Canadian origin. And so they were shocked and they were very upset. So the Asian Students Alliance came together and organized a Zoom. In fact, it was more as a forum to share their shock, their frustration, and their anger, and actually their concern, their anxiety, and their fear. The loss of sense of security, the loss of sense of, belonging. So they got together, and there were 80 or 90 of them on the Zoom chat. And during the Zoom chat, and they were having a very, very good conversation. They felt warmth and, the embrace of each other. And while they were doing that, 3 white men joined in, bombed the Zoom meeting. One of them turned on the camera very briefly and waved arrival in front of them. So you can imagine these students who are already traumatized by these red packets with JAWS money, and then further traumatized by these white men, we suspected, of course, white supremacists, who threatened them with this violence, a symbol of violence, of course, arrival in their own space, in the space that they felt that they could feel supported and secured and safe. So you can imagine this event taking place in the year of the Tiger 2020 in Toronto. I will speak a bit more later about the U of T response, and which definitely is a lesson for us to all learn. So this kind of response is, in fact, not shocking in some ways to us who lived in the Western world, who are filled with images of exotic, Chinese, as well as superstitious Chinese. We are either hypersexualized as Asian women, Chinese women, or we are gangsters or kung fu master. I like Bruce Lee. I respect his work tremendously. And I also respect the tremendous efforts made by Asian Canadians, Chinese Canadians, and other East Asians or Southeast Asian, actors and actresses who are doing their best to show their talent and to make it, in this Hollywood world. But unfortunately, we are still so defined by how the white people see us. We are still so constrained and restricted within those images. The image, the picture on the left, I think it's the newest show, I think on Netflix. I I think it's called The Warrior. I actually watched an episode and was totally not happy with this, even though the show, it was produced, written, directed, probably not direct, but written and produced by Asian American and Asian Canadian, artists. But I just felt bad that why at this time we still are so confined to how white people see us, that we have to, in order to get them to watch us, our talent, our show, we have to live up to that stereotypes. We have to be defined and confined to those stereotypes. So that makes me very upset. And so because of all these, how the Hollywood define, how the mainstream culture define us, we are stuck in that mode of being foreigners, right? So, and because of that, we are always questioned of our loyalty, of our interest in really, do we really commit to Canada, or you are just all Chinese? So these are just examples of headlines in newspaper, Chinese Canadian groups and China, so law, China's fight against Canada, allies in Korean War, Chinese Canadian suffering in silence as China's United Front reaches in Canada. So again, all these are, and of course, RCMP receives hundreds of tips on Chinese agents' activities. The geopolitical dynamic happening between China and Canada definitely have an impact on us. And there are people who try to equate anti-China as anti-Chinese racism or anti-Asian racism. I disagree, because I believe anti-Chinese and anti-Asian racism has its root before this anti-China dynamic came about. But however, there is definitely an impact. The geopolitical dynamic basically exacerbate the fact that Chinese are seen as not loyal to Canada. We are forever loyal to call our motherland, regardless whether we have any connections to China, the present day China, or not. Just speak about my own family. My father left China when he was 16. My mother was born in the Philippines, even though she had to go back. But most of us were born in Hong Kong, and many of my family members are from the Philippines for more than 3 generations. So, so we definitely have our connection to China is very different, of course, than immigrants who are still now connected to China or came from China directly. So, however, but just because the way we look, our last name, we are forever stuck that you are Chinese and you are not Canadian. And then I actually looked up recently of course, our heart broke for Ukraine, for Ukrainians, fighting for their own country, for their sovereignty. So I looked up, sort of how do media portrays Russian Canadians, right? And I did look up and found some very interesting, of course, media reports. There was one report that says Canadian website actually trying to boost the Russian propaganda, supporting Putin's, this invasion of Ukraine. And the heading is Canadian website supporting Putin. So I looked up, I said, what Canadian website? And in fact, that website was, and this was on National Post, that website was hosted by a Russian Canadian economist, an award-winning professor. So, and I sit back and say, if this was a case of Chinese Canadian economists and Chinese Canadian professor, chances are, I would guess, that the media would say Chinese Canadian, scholar supports Putin and not Canadian website. So again, because of racism, because of bias, because of the white privilege and white supremacy, Chinese Canadians, we will always be subject to different lens And this forever foreigner stereotype is with us. And not only were we seen as forever foreigners, we are always seen as model minority, that we are subservient. We will kowtow and bow to, and we will not speak up against racism. We'll just take it, And let me tell you, when I was talking to the Asian Canadian community, from parents and seniors and professionals and others across the country in the last 2 years, I have to say that many of them don't speak up. All of them, I would say 99.999%. In fact, I would say 100%. All of us have some experience to share about anti-Asian racism, about our personal experience with direct racism from as a kid in school being bullied, taunted, and even beaten up just because we're Chinese or we look Chinese, and and the lunch we bring is different or smell and all that, to professional in healthcare settings or other settings in Canada, subjected to all kinds of sexist, misogynist, and racist, and stereotypical attack. And I have to say, the truth is, majority of us have said they put it up. For new immigrants, they put it up because that's their first job. 5 years in a childcare center that she felt racist, bullied, but she didn't speak up because she needed that job. She needed that Canadian experience. She needed the reference to move on, to build a career. That we have seen professionals, regulated professionals, did not speak up because for fear of reprisal. They're going to be shunned in the profession. They are not going to get the job again in other settings. That's the truth. That is the truth, that and this kind of further sort of, entrench, like, oh, you can beat them up and they won't say anything, right? But in fact, I'm sure that many racialized communities, including Black, including other communities, will be subjected to years of, severe oppression and all that. Unfortunately, that's the response. And for the Chinese, it's this model minority that you're always good in math and science, and totally pigeonhole you and restrict your development, restrict your growth, and would not allow you to break out that stereotype is hurtful. And we always treat it as homogeneous group, as if it, regardless of what we look, where we are from and what language we speak or not speak, we will always be seen as the homogeneous group. And microaggressions, as I've said, is like a daily sort of experience we have throughout. And these are deep-rooted, right? Anti-Chinese racism is deep-rooted in Canada, starting with John A. Macdonald, the founding father of Canada, who actually did bring in these Chinese labor because they were cheaper than the white labor. And they were willing to do the most dangerous part of the railway, which is through the Rockies, because they had to blast through the rocks and build tunnels. And there was a saying that for every mile of the CN Railway, there was a Chinese worker die in that process. And so these laborers were brought in as cheap labor, as machines. And after the completion, John A. Macdonald and his cabinet and the government, was very worried that these, yellow peril and this evil, is going to taint the Aryan race. The mongrel race will taint and threaten the pure white Aryan race. That was their main concern. So that's why there was an imposition of head tax, and then further the Exclusion Act that totally banned Chinese from coming. So more than 60 long years of immigration policy that specifically targeted the banning of an exclusion of group, and that's the first ever. And in fact, since then there is no Chinese, or there's no exclusion act that highlighted any other racial groups. And in 1907, white mobs rampaged in Chinatown and Japantown in Vancouver. And it's not new. In Toronto, Chinatown has been also rampaged by white mobs because of the anger towards the laundry, the Chinese laundry, because they do it cheaper, and they were seen to be threatening other laundry. So there was all these, threats, perceived economic, social, and of course, the racial threat felt by the white people. And again, Chinese is not the only one that we've been discriminated, that Canada has discriminated against. South Asian Canadians have also subjected to these tremendous exclusion. So there was, but the difference is, let's say that in India at the time was part of the Commonwealth. So Canada, being part of the Commonwealth under the same queen, or king at the time, what can we do? We can't blatantly say, well, Indians can't come. We're a part of the same, same king under the same, emperor. What can we do? So there was always ingenious ways that white people came up to exclude. So they came up with this idea that if you were to come from India, you have to purchase this single, sort of continuous journey, one continuous ticket arrangement to come from India to Canada, which did not exist at all at the time. So we didn't say that you cannot come, but if you want to come, you have to purchase one ticket. So at the end, of course, that means nobody could come. And in 1914, 376 prospective immigrants from India, they boarded the boat in India. They went through Hong Kong. The, Kamagata Maru actually came to Canada, but they could not disembark. They were barred from disembarking. And 2 months later, they were sent back. And so this rule of this continuous take-and-take arrangement is in effect until 1951, when they were replaced with quota from India, Sri Lanka, and other places. So as you probably have heard, Japanese Canadians, the internment of Japanese Canadian, devastating. So now, in fact, Ukrainian were interned during the First World War, because when we were fighting for redress on Hit Tax and Exclusion Act, we actually did work with the Ukrainian Canadian National Congress, because they were also seeking, but the number was very small. Many of them have passed on, of course, right? But Japanese internment was a very recent experience. And again, a dark history of Canada, where Japanese, who many of them had no connections even then with Japan, because they came here in 1895. So by 1941, you can imagine already at least a generation or two here. So they were barred from coming. They were all stripped of their possession, their properties, and they were mostly farmers because of racism. They couldn't go into profession, just like Chinese. They were barred from being doctors doctors and lawyers and all that. They were stuck in farming. And many of the Japanese Canadians, just like Chinese at the time, there was lots of municipal legislation, provincial legislation that barred them from engaging in a business. For example, there are certain roads you cannot transport rice on this road. That means Chinese and Japanese who eat a lot of rice cannot even use that road to transport rice. So Japanese were interned during the World War. 21,000 of them were considered enemy aliens, and they were interned. And many of them were asked to prove their loyalty even after the war to move west. So some of them did sign paper to went back. Like, I don't blame them. I said, what the, this country did not want me. Why would I stay? So in the pandemic, all these systemic racism that we brought had just really reared its heads and exacerbated. Just want to tell you that the new report will be coming out very soon. And it showed that over 900 hate incidents were reported to 2 portals in Toronto and Vancouver to our partner organizations, representing a 47% increase from the year before. So while people think, oh, no, you don't hear it as much, that means there's no more attack. That's so not true. And in fact, in the new data, you're going to see that more, not just Chinese, but more and more Southeast Asian are being attacked. And these Southeast Asian could be from Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, or Philippines. And because they love Chinese, because the same thing, when they were being attacked, dirty Chinese, bad eating Chinese, like go back to China, was all part of the narrative of the white supremacist, movement. And so when we face all these systemic racism, of course, there is impact on us, right? The poverty rates. And there is, in spite of the model minority myth, 23% of Chinese in Ontario actually live under the poverty line. And a recent report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives showing that Chinese seniors actually had the highest poverty rate of all the groups that they study, including South Asian, Blacks, and Indigenous, and white, of course. And systemic employment, racism employment. When we talk to immigrants, they all knew. Actually, immigrants all knew, regardless whether they're from India or from China, they all knew that their own name would exclude them. And it's true. U of T and Ryzen did a report that if you're an Asian sounding last name like Go, you have 30% less chance to be called for an interview. And if I use my Chinese name, the whole name Tang Tang Go, it's even worse. That for sure, they wouldn't even bother to interview me. So it's still very entrenched and very much part of the employment. And in fact, when we talk to settlement agencies, many of the agencies said, we should confront this issue. The employers are racist. The employers are discriminating against, Asians and others, immigrants, just because they don't want them. They think they want white, they want English speaking, they don't want these foreigners. And so when we look at this, right, let's apply anti-racism, anti-oppression lens to the system to promote systemic fundamental change, which means we really need to tilt the power differential. We really need to challenge all the stereotypes and stigma. And we really need to recognize that Asian Canadian communities are diverse and there are so much regional differences across Canada, in Ontario, across Canada. And really fundamentally, we urge each and every one of us to look inside, right? To see where we sit. Where are my biases and where are my, definitely I came with biases, I came with stigma, and I have to constantly check myself. And I also know that in certain position that I have certain power, but I know that in relation to the bigger system, a white supremacist system, my power is very different. And I would urge all of us to consider all these when we are embarking on a change process. And I'm just going to end with playing this, this video. I hope you will enjoy this.
Amy, just from the interpreter, would you mind turning on the captions if you can?
Okay.
Thank you.
Can you see, or is it, oh. 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 I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm gonna.
Take your time, Amy. I'm also trying on my end to see if I can open the link.
Sorry, I'm having problem. Oh, here.
So we cannot hear from the video. If you want to just reshare it one more time with the video on.
Amy, did you catch that? Did you hear the participant? So we can't hear the video, Amy?
Sorry?
We can't hear the video, so we're wondering if you can restart the video with the sound.
Oh.
Somebody has shared that when you need to select, you need to select a share sound when you share the video.
Oh. Sorry, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So the sound's not working.
Oh, so sorry.
Yes. So we're wondering if you can restart the video, and also I think when you hit, you have to stop the screen share, start again, and at the bottom left, you'll also select share computer sound.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, so before, oh yes, share sound, got it.
Perfect.
Oh, sorry.
It's not always as friendly. Awesome. Perfect, we can hear.
We have never been a loud people. Our elders always taught us that actions speak louder than words, so we learned to keep our heads down, keep our grades up, keep our kin close, keep our mouths shut. I wonder, what it does to a people when they stay quiet for so long. Do they forget their voice? The sound of their stories, the resilience of language? When you are no longer in your motherland, does your mother tongue still sing of home? What work songs lifted our spirits as we built the railroad? What prayers did we whisper as they sent us to camps in the mountains to meditate on all the ways we don't belong to this country? So we stayed quiet. As they burned our Chinatowns down and spit on our grandmas at bus stops, we stayed quiet. As they laughed in our faces and told us to go back where we came from, but they've mistaken our silence for compliance. Looked on our meekness as weakness. See, we, and not the submissive stereotype that's been depicted on silence, on us, they've gotten it twisted. See, silence is golden, as are we. A gradient of yellow to brown, every Koreatown a little Saigon an act of defiance. Every hunchback elder a humble giant. Silence is grace in the triumph, is peace in the riot. Silence is bold, a force. It is the brewing calm before the coming storm, and now the sky is splitting open and the rage is pouring forth, so this is for every kid who has ever tried to pull their nose bridge to make it taller. Every time they mocked us because our eyes are smaller. This is for our elders, both alive and remembered. For their lessons, the tough and the tender. For our full names, past and present, may they be pronounced. May they be respected. For every chink in the national fabric, every nip in the winter wind of prairie towns and northern hamlets coast to coast on stolen land. We are here. We've been here. From takeout joints and internment camps to internships and graduation caps, we are strong. We have pride. We fight. We fall. We rise. And to the ones who say we don't belong, it's them who should open their eyes.
Thank you so much for listening to this, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that your insightful.
Sorry.
Can you hear me? Is the sound working? Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, we can hear you, Amy and Asha. We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, perfect. I have a question from the from participants.
Okay, yes.
Oh, perfect.
Sorry.
Yes, that's okay. Thank you so much, Amy, for your presentation. A few folks are asking if the link to the video will be shared.
Yeah, sure. I can
Sure,
do
okay.
that.
I will
I
do that.
will do it now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for your presentation. And we will move into discussion. I did note in the presentation, Amy, at the end, you had a question. Did you want me to pose the question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay, sure. So the final question following the video in Amy's presentation is, what do you plan to do to combat anti-Asian racism? And so I'm thinking we can leave with that. We'll end with that thought. We'll go into the wellness break, which will be about 5 minutes. So we'll return about 10:56. And then we'll go into discussion beginning with Amy's question.
And I have cut and pasted the video on the chat room, so you can all see that, hopefully.
Perfect. Yes, it's available.
Great.
Amy, there. Yeah, so we'll take the wellness break for about 5 minutes. So we'll return around 10:56. You're welcome to stay if you'd like. Turn off your camera, and then we will begin with the discussion.
I'm sitting right here. How did I not hear my phone ring?
Oh, Rose,
How'd it go?
Rose. Oh yeah, there we go. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully folks are making their way back to their space. Amy, I want to again thank you for such an incredible and powerful presentation. Some of the responses from folks have been similar to my sentiments, and sharing your insights and your knowledge with us all. I certainly learned a lot in this presentation, and actually in thinking about how I look at anti-racism and how I go about really navigating the space when it comes to equity work. So I want to open the floor to the audience. I do have some questions prepared. I also had drafted some questions throughout the presentation, speaking to some of the discussion that you brought up. But I do want to open the floor to folks first. If anyone has any questions or comments, or would like to answer the reflection question. And you're free to use the chat or use the raise a hand function. Don't want to rush the space, but I'll move on. And if folks throughout the presentation, or sorry, throughout the discussion, have any additional questions, please feel free to ask them. So I will say we have about an hour remaining, depending on how long the conversation goes for. We will aim to end around 11:55, just to give folks some time to say closing remarks and ask any other final questions. So Amy, I do have some questions around the discussion. And one that came to me that I would like to begin with is around this concept of belonging, which you did mention. And it often comes up in spaces, and folks really want to begin to understand how to conceptualize what belonging means, because it is an infinite spectrum really for folks. So the question I have is, while belonging is on an infinite spectrum, how can organizations and individuals support creating healthy environments for individuals? And what can they do not only to address, but support the harm caused to racialized or marginalized individuals? And I think I'm mostly referring to the example today that you shared at the University of Toronto.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Asha, for that question. And in fact, let me just premise by saying, I think these are all questions that we, even as advocates, continue to explore and discuss and, and engage the communities. And there's no, there's no one way to deal to, right? And it's always an evolving and a journey for all of us, right? And let me, maybe I can say, premise by sharing the experience at U of T, and maybe some insight can be gained from there, right? Given I started with that example. So the U of T actually, through one of their VPs, reached out to me because we happened to sit on a panel just last year on anti-Asian racism. And so he, as a senior leader at U of T, was quite, of course, concerned with what happened and wanted to get my feedback and hear, what from the outside, people advocating against systemic racism, what we think. And so we had an amazing dialogue because, of course, that the fact that we were on this same panel where we share a lot of the same, perspectives and the underpinning value, right? That there is a recognition of systemic racism. But of course, each institution comes with their own institutional culture, right? And its own institutional issues and context and their commitment, right? It differs. So unfortunately, I think at the initial response from U of T, what I found in writing, did not, while they acknowledged pain that they have incurred, right? They acknowledged there's pain and suffering as a result of this incident. They did not connect that to systemic racism, right? Which I find is a huge gap, isn't it? Right? So the conversation we had was around that, right? So, and in fact, for this VP, he understood that, he could see the link. But how do you move an institution, a huge institution, to that link? And then subsequently, one of the organizers of that Zoom chat happened to be a U of T professor, also reached out and really wanted to see how we can, move this forward to address this challenge, with U of T. So I connected the two organizations, and they had, from all what I gathered, was a very good conversation, and the willingness and the commitment to move, to collaborate and hear each other out. And to me, while I think the effort made by an institution, first of all, to recognize that a mistake has been made, second of all, to be willing to open to criticism and willing to voices that differ from their own, I think that's important. And also, I think that the fundamental thing is that the institution needs to recognize systemic problem, that they need to recognize there is systemic discrimination, racism, and they need to ensure that there is commitment to address that. Without that, really, how can we move this on, right? How can we? And from the perspective then of the communities, and I'm sure so far, many of us now, and I came from a social work background, when I went to the School of Social Work, we actually never, ever, ever talked about pain and suffering and trauma and injury incurred by race, racism, racist attacks. That was not on when I went, and that was, of course, many years ago. I'm not young, right? And there was no recognition of how the system, like not only is that person racialized who, because of their race, because they're woman, because they're low income, that all this intersectionality, have already been suffering the consequences to no fault of their own, right? So they are kept poor, and they are marginalized, they are discriminated, and they, don't have access. The thing is that the system then further impose more pain on them when they come out to seek help. So as social workers, right, we very often will try to address the issues presented to us by our clients, but we don't look at the system that have hurt them, right? And we never talk about the trauma because of the system has hurt them so much, right? The trauma that they have suffered as a result. So the students now at U of T who received those packages have traumatized and then further traumatized. So they know the trauma, they actually speak to the impact of trauma. They speak to the pain of that trauma. And that trauma actually, why is that so traumatic, right? Why is it so painful? Was that because at U of T, they are part of a student body where they think everybody is the same, right? That I am part of a family of students, that school is this big umbrella, this family where, students, this should be the happiest time of your life, right? That, that somebody is paying your tuition or you're paying your tuition these days, right? Or that you would hope that this institution will protect me or provide me with that safety. And that sense of safety is intrinsic or is so related to our sense of belonging. When we feel belong because I can be an authentic self, I don't feel insecure. I feel I feel that I can be safe in my own identity, in my own expression, in my, and being myself. And when that safety really has been shattered, that comes with then your sense of belonging. So, wow, I think I can be, happily going after, my own business, just study, do well, and not to worry about. But no, I am attacked because of who I am in a place where I think I can be myself, right? So I think all this advice or help me, understand further in terms of that. First of all, we call it trauma-informed, care, trauma-informed support, and what it means to belong, right? What it means to belong is that I can be myself and feel safe to be myself, that I would be accepted for who I am.
Thank you for that, Amy. I think there are some comments, and I want to circle back to some of the conversations, but in the chat. But this really brings up for me, and I think as part of the larger conversation, this embodied experience related to systemic racism that is often forgotten, and that we often disassociate the mind and the body. Which is, it's integral to the experience of individuals in an oppressive system. And when that disconnect is made, even as practitioners, we then perpetuate and maintain, racism and oppression for individuals we are seeking to support. So that brings me back to a comment posed in the chat around at the grassroots level. And I think in your response, there was an intersection between, or emerging really, of administration and the experience of folks at the grassroots level or the community level. And the person wrote, perhaps more work at the grassroots level is required to promote awareness on racism, on how racism virus is more deadly than corona and other viruses of such as we have vaccination to protect ourselves against COVID, but there is no vaccination against racism except for speaking up against it. Mm-hmm. And so the question I had around that was is around education and awareness, and sort of fostering what you've been speaking to. How do you say or see the role of the Canadian government and member agencies to raise awareness or provide education in the settlement sector as they are supporting individuals in settlement within Canada?
Absolutely. And just like, I am glad that actually I'm not practicing in the front line. I'm, to say, because I know that I would not be able to do a good job. I recognize the complexity. I recognize the tremendous difficulty, in being in the front line. And I always come with this, because I believe that we all need to be driven by our own sense of principles and values and, and our philosophy of life, right? And as practitioner, as an organizer, and that applies to individuals who are working as practitioners and to the organization, has to be driven by a set of common values and philosophy, isn't it, right? So I believe that if I, were back in the front line, I would have practiced so differently now, even compared to when I was still, practicing decades ago, because I really want each and every one of us to see the connections, as you said earlier, between the individual experience and the systemic, the context, right? So if I were to serve a Chinese immigrant, a newly arrived from wherever, from China even, that I would know right away the context that this person is in, right? Regardless of where this person is settling in Canada, the barriers, the challenges, and the difficulties, and the hurdles that this person will have to go through. And that understanding is important, right? And that connections, and to, as we social workers, is that to understand that empathy, right? Plus also to understand that if I am true to myself, that I am willing to give up that power, to share that power, to share that. So I need to do further. I need to share knowledge. I need to share power in decision-making. I am no longer a social worker patronizing the clients. I believe you should do this, but, let's look at what you can do, in the context of, that option, that presentation, that power dynamic has to be completely changed. And importantly, I think the lens, the value, the underpinning is underpinning anti-racism, anti-oppression, anti-discrimination lens, right? That we understand where this person is at in the context, and also understand the biases and discrimination this person is going to bring, right? That this person likely, very likely, when you are exploring, when you're talking, that we all have biases. And we should explore those biases. And if we were to confront them, you have the responsibility to address them, right? So I think that's why I said I'm glad I'm not practicing, because it's so complex, right? That you see the individual, the true authentic of that individual in terms of the person's identity and intersectional identity. Could be a, transgendered, racialized, low income, or somebody with disability, and all that, right? You need to understand all that context,
Right.
accept the person's identities, accept their authenticity, and put it in the system context, share that knowledge and power. Knowledge is power. You have to share as much as you can in terms of what you know and what can help them, navigate the system. Plus, you also need to recognize and speak up if you see, hey, things are off a bit here, right? So that is, to me, that's why it's so difficult. And that's why, and then if you look at the organization, in order to allow this to happen, you can imagine how the organization then need to behave, how you are training your staff, how you are providing professional development opportunities, how you are power sharing with your staff, particularly those in the front line who feel so powerless, right? And how you are also sharing knowledge and all the expertise that you get, resources to ensure that they can do the best that they can in the front line. And so I think, and to amplify the values of the organization in every single thing that you do, in every single operation that you do. And because, I as a consultant, I do work with nonprofit organizations, settlement agencies, healthcare centers, and all that, right? And I do understand the challenges, the lack of resources and all that. But it is very disheartening sometimes when you see, something is more than just, a resource issue, right? And I think it is important also to have frank and open discussions within the organizations, right? Because actually the last year, as I said before, the workers themselves, particularly the racialized, or people with different gender identity, sexual orientation, and all the intersectional challenges and oppressions, they feel hurt by the organization. They feel oppressed by the organization. How can anybody who feel oppressed be an effective, intervener or facilitator at the front line, serving and helping someone else, right? And so that's why I think there's so much that should be done, and recognizing who has that power, right? The front line, and unfortunate that, yes, I've seen. And when you go to an organization, you get poor service, and then you went, oh my goodness, that person must not be paid well, right? Must have received very, very poor support and resources, and don't even get the recognition, right? And the person probably cannot even be truly their authentic self, right? Their identities need to be hidden, because for fear of, right? Lack of job security, lack of whatever, right? So I would, think that each organization needs to think of all these when we are planning, when we are developing our resources, when we are prioritizing what the organization needs to do. No less so in settlement agency. Just because we serve immigrants, just because we serve newcomers, doesn't mean that we are already practicing from anti-racist angle. Doesn't mean that we are operating from anti-oppressive angle at all. So I think we need to have that fundamental shift, and as a practitioner, and as organization as a whole.
I love what you said toward the end of that around the shift and the assumption that working in a space makes you almost immune to the systemic realities of a context. And I think one of the takeaways from what you said, Amy, was or is really the idea that if we're going to confront our biases, we must also challenge them. Yes. And so I do love that. And there's another question, and as you spoke of context, I think there's an assumption around being in Toronto and larger cities that we are more culturally aware, if you will, for lack of a better word, or integrated. And that's really not the case. So the question in the chat from one of the participants asks, would you say that racism happens more in condensed areas like Toronto, Vancouver, where there are more immigrants than others? And they pose two questions, so I'll pose the other. What do you and everyone think of having overrepresented immigration levels from one country or region?
So, in fact, if I could just use the anti-racism reporting that we have done recently, the new report will come up. But even in the last year, when we reported 1,150 hate incidents across the country, these incidents happen across the country. Vancouver, Toronto, small and big, in every single province. So you may think, oh, wow, who are are there really any Asian in Newfoundland, or I believe Yukon, it's like every single place in the country we have received reports. And if you look at the proportional population, you would think Vancouver having more Asians, then they probably have fewer cases, proportionally, right? If you look at the population, if you look at the proportion, then they should not be as bad because there's so many Asian there. They should be better off, right? If some of the argument, right? No, that's just not true at all. Not true at all. So I think that's why, that to argue that just because you have more of one kind or more of another, or more of another community, then you have built that that immunity, or that, to me, when you look at the data, that doesn't seem to jive. Yeah. However, of course, the difference, I think, is because first of all, let me just say this, because white supremacy, just like John A. Macdonald, when he said we need to get rid of these Chinese, is that sense of threat to their identity, right? It's that sense of that this Aryan race is invaded by these racialized, people of color, right? These Blacks, these Asians, that these are tainting and threatening the survival of our Aryan race, right? That sense of threat. So big city, small city, when you have that element of thinking, it doesn't matter because the threat to them is real. You can have one Asian or one racialized group, and that sense of threat is real. Invasion is coming, right? But the difference, I think, there is a difference is in the support, in the resources. Because ultimately, unfortunately, that's just the way that things are organized, right? Even like give an example of funding, right? Of government funding. They do, of course, fund. It's not proportional to, and that's why we have such a gap in rural urban, right? In smaller settings where the lack of resources is tremendous, right? There's no equity lens to regional differences and disparities, right? And so, yes, in bigger settings, when something like this happens, there are more resources because, the communities themselves have built support around them, right? And just like, CCNC or Project 1907 in Vancouver or other communities across, and mainly we are in big cities. We are in Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, and in the sort of like so-called capital cities of the province, right? Very few, because the sheer number is that there are just not that many in smaller settings, right? So I think the difference, yes, is where you can seek help and where resources are at. And that has to do with the communities being able, with a bigger volume, being able to come together. And then also the funding, how the funding is structured, how, and all that. Plus, of course, I also think that I think in smaller settings and where you don't have that volume, I think more people in the smaller settings tend to even more concerned about speaking up, right? And they are not as upfront to fight for it, because if I speak up more, because the small community is so small, right, that I would be even a higher target, right, or even more prominent target. There will always be that element. I remember speaking to a racialized transgendered person, comparing their experience in Toronto and in Ottawa. Even Toronto and in Ottawa, it's really that community support that they were able to find here than in Ottawa, right? So I think that's where lies the difference. And that also speaks to why settlement agencies need to think about, so where are your clients now? Because now that because of the high cost of housing, right, that many newcomers, immigrants are pushed to areas where the lower cost of housing is making life slightly easier for them, right? And I know from speaking to settlement agencies, and they are doing that, right? They are moving out, and the population census show that Toronto only increased by 2.3%. And in some pockets of Toronto, there is a decrease in population versus, the general Canadian population. And except for downtown Toronto, it's like 50% increase, because I believe it's a condo, here. But the increase has been in the outskirts, right? Durham and other regions, because of the lack of housing, affordable housing. So for settlement agencies in these, while you see the trend of newcomers, immigrants going to places where there are lack of support, I don't believe there are lots of, I can see that there are Durham, agencies here. But as compared to Toronto, I'm sure, right, there's still a gap. So how can agencies in smaller setting be better resourced? Plus, how can they collaborate with bigger city agencies so that the needs can be met in those smaller settings where the newcomers, where the immigrants are moving to, and where the challenges are tremendous, right? That doesn't mean that it's easier for them. They will still confront racism. They will still confront all kind of isms in where they are.
Thank you so much. I had a question around intersecting identities, which you spoke to, and thinking about the individual experience, but also how they navigate certain spaces and overlapping systems, such as housing, which is a crisis, food insecurity, which is also a crisis, healthcare and education, and even the justice system, which in many ways, there's often an exclusion of Asian conversation within the justice system or around that. So I guess the question before I move on to the last question in the chat is, why is it essential for folks in the settlement sector to consider this? And how do we make this more accessible for practitioners when thinking about some of these competing needs or the demands of, everyday work?
I know. That's why I said it's so hard, isn't it? That that intersectional lens is so critical to all the work, because me, as I said, right? I was born in Hong Kong, but my family has deep roots in the Philippines. I'm woman, and I'm entering, soon to the senior phase. My identity is not just one, right? Not just Chinese Canadian, but all these have shaped my life and continue to influence the day-to-day living that I have. And similarly, the clients and the communities that we are working with, have every single one of them comes with that multiple identity and multiple, of intersectional identity. So it is so important for us to recognize all that and be able and to allow the client to speak to that, right? The community to speak to their experiences, share their experiences and their multiple identities, right? And be informed by their lived experiences. And that's why we always say, as service provider, we need that. We need to be continuously checking in, right? And have those strong voices and centering on the lived experiences of the communities that we supposedly are serving, right? Yes. That and get that dialogue, get that, and how do we include them in that decision-making, in that planning of service, so that we are truly responsive, right? That we are truly, catering our resources to the high priority areas and all that, right? Right. And also, I think it is important to, as you said, because when a client came in and asked for help in housing, right? And we need to, of course, understand the whole lack of housing, affordability, and all those issues. But the the situation that they are at right now would impact on access to housing. They don't have credits. History of credit. New immigrants, where do you get history of credit? Where do you even find that? How can you access that? What's the problem here? The banking system. They don't recognize, that quote unquote foreign credits, right? And if you don't, how do you even rent? How do you even, access? And so that's why many of them are subjected to the exploitation of landlords, right? They are at the mercy, right? And so if we have a parent in a school system, right? With the children in school system, we understand how school system may not be kind. The children are experiencing, differential treatment, bullying, and all that. They may start to not want to go to school. Who's to blame? Not the school, the parent. And if the parent is racialized, who is being called in? Especially if Black parents, Indigenous parents, who is being called in? Child service, children's service, children's aid. Who will be then impacted, and how the system treats, Black parents and Black families. And, so all, so as providers, we need to understand, and we need to understand that role, right? The racialized or the immigrant or the newcomer, they come into Canada and they establish a family, or they are mother, they are sister, they are, they are grandchildren, they are grandparents, or they are, whatever identity. So on top of their social identities, they also have, all these roles that they take in life, right? To help build the family, to help grow. And all that would impact on their experiences depending on their identities. So that's why I said we really have to understand how each system that they interact with differentially impacts on them. And how do we help them navigate that system when there are such tremendous barriers, right? And that's why you have to come with, that, and that's why, like back to, again, organizations. So how do you empower your staff, right? How do you enable them to have all this ability and all the skills and all the knowledge to support the clients that you truly want to support? So
that's helpful. It's powerful. And thinking also about a few questions I'm going to pose as well, also about referring to textbooks in academia, so the institutionalization really of this work and how it's reinforced through practices, and using the lived experience and the realities of individuals to actually inform and challenge those systems that exist. So one of the comments in the chat is, I'm really resonating with what you were saying, Amy. As a U of T graduate student, I am directly seeing the impact that the rise of anti-Asian hate is having on my Asian classmates. I am wondering what advice you have for our students in terms of advocating for a commitment by faculty to take accountability for anti-racism within the classroom, hiring of more racialized faculty, etc.
Absolutely. And that's why, that the students, regardless of who, your own identity, right? Your own social identities and all the various, intersectional identity that we all have the responsibility to speak up. And so, that how do we affect system change? Basically, this question is, how do we affect system change? And in this case, system change at universities. It's not easy, right? As I said, it's like moving mountain, but anything helps, right? Everything helps. And we need to, of course, be constantly on the guard, right? Constantly be able to apply our anti-racism, anti-oppression lens to the work that we do in the classroom that I am in, right? In my interaction with my fellow students and with the professors, be able to challenge, be able to speak up, be able to reflect that in my work, right? Just even on an individual level. And to move beyond the classroom, like are there actions that in a university that I can join that would be collective in efforts to address change, right? So part of students' movement, part of students' union, part of, that body that shares my value, that, that shares these common principles, right? Of anti-racism, anti-oppression and all that. And also be able to advance that knowledge. So if I talk to my student friends and others who may not always be on board, how can I share that knowledge, and how can I share and help influence others, right? Through the work that I do and through the conversations and through the network that I built, right? So these are just for me as an individual, right? But I hope, of course, as an institution like U of T and all that, that they have employment equity, that they do have that equity in hiring practices, not only in faculty, but of course in the administration, the operation side and all that. across the whole spectrum, right? From every level all the way to the top, so that the administration and the leadership, as well as the faculty, do reflect the faces, of a very diverse Canada, right? And do reflect and do actually appreciate and understand the systemic nature of impact on students, right? So what I find sometimes with academics is like I'm only teaching engineering, right? I'm only doing this. But no, what you do, what you emulate, yes, how you emulate your values is shown in your interaction, in your class. How you treat a white student versus a female Black student versus an Asian gay young person will show, right? How your biases and how there is sometimes I find in academia, there is this like perceived objectivity that we are objective. We don't succumb to biases and stereotypes. You do. How can you not, right? How can you not? So I think it's important for faculty to recognize that, right? I think it's important for all of us to recognize the biases and stereotypes, right? Even you may be a science teacher, a neuroscientist and all that. You carry that biases in every day of your life and in interaction that you have with the faculty, with the administration, and with your students.
Right.
And if you don't recognize the systemic nature of that, you fail. You will never be a good professor, from my view, because you will never understand the lived experiences of those who don't look like you. How can you be truly a mentor, a teacher, when you don't recognize that bias? So I think there's so much that universities can do, like, starting from, of course, the top, and really having this critique, right? This critical look of themselves and critical, and put their values into practice, and to make sure that this academia thing, to get rid of this objectivity, that bothers me a lot. And of course, the other thing is the freedom of speech, which is a huge issue in academia, right? Recently that we finally have that person, now I can't remember, the professor resign, a white supremacist, right?
Right.
It
From
took
University
years.
of Toronto.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So why did it take so long? Like, how, if somebody thinks like that, how can I trust that he would be fair to racialized staff? Right? So that freedom of speech should not be a shield, right? I believe, of course, if we look at the world around us, right, the freedom of speech, freedom of expression is threatened. Right? Look at how Russia, look at what they're doing. First is to trample on that right, is to shut down the access to information, access to expression of dissent, similar to other authoritarian countries around the world, right? Similar to, it's to shut down debate, shut down discussion. And so I firmly believe and firmly value our right of expression, our right to have that ability to speak our minds, right? However, as we know, it's not an absolute right, right? It is contained, it is within, it has to be done within our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It can never cross the line to hurt, to harm, and to be hateful. So oops. Can you still hear me?
We can see you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me though?
Hear you, yes.
Okay, good. Somehow my computer said that I need to shut down some app, otherwise it's not working.
Oh,
so
I
I don't know. I know, but good thing you can still hear me.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is that we need to, of course, academia, they pride itself in freedom of expression, and I totally understand that.
Right.
But it is to what extent, right? To what limit? And how can we ensure that it's always balanced within that freedom? Because your freedom of speech will impede on my freedom. In fact, my freedom as a person, not just my ability to speak up, but my safety, my security, my being able to belong and be, to live my life. So I think it's important to think of all that when we are talking about academia, and we are talking about how the academia needs to improve itself and now to advance, right? It's equity agenda.
Yes. And really seeing ourselves as part of the problem, in that equation, including ourselves, and instead of being objective or outside of.
Exactly.
So we have a question, and I know for the sake of time. So I have a comment and two questions I want to pose to you, Amy, before we wrap up around 11:55. So the first question is part of the problem with racism is that we are constantly having to defend our Black, Asian, white, Indigenous, etc. side, and we fail to show that there are allies to our communities. Examples, people from the white community who are not white supremacists, but support different groups. I also want to add to this question, because I think it's very important, if you can speak to it briefly, the conversation of lateral racism and how that's perpetuated. It perpetuates anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, Islamophobia, et cetera, in both ways, always, right? So if you could speak to that, that'd be
of course.
Thank you.
And as I said earlier, right, when we are as frontline workers, you are examine your biases, right? Examine and when you are working with a client who is a new immigrant, I am sure you will also see that biases and that stereotypes and all that discrimination, right? Anti-Black racism is a worldwide issue. Anti-Indigenous racism is a worldwide issue, right? So how can we, and how, then I would be surprised that, the communities that you work with are immune to that. The deep-seated Islamophobia is so entrenched worldwide, right? And so people who are from, wherever they are, will come with that. They are acculturated, they are all. So that's why I said we need to bring ourselves, examine our own biases, and when we are working with the client, inevitably you may hear that. And we did. Like when I was doing, when I did the conversations across the country with parents, with seniors, it showed, yes, of course, you would hear that. And so how do you make sure that you don't let it slide, right? Don't let it slide, speak up and take that moment to see how we can work on this issue together, right? It's not the problem just with the client. No, it's not. It is a systemic problem that I'm with it too, right? So how can we, as an organization, support the staff, support the organization to address these and confront these issues, right? So that the staff wouldn't feel, oh my God, all these racist, anti-Black racist views and all that, what are we gonna do, right? And all these talk about the Indigenous, oh, they're lazy, they deserve it, right? And all this, is, they are all terrorists. So how do we do that, right? And how do we make sure that is, and also, of course, there is the worldview about Chinese, right? That, how do we also confront that and address that? So as an organization, we do need to address that, be open, confront that, and give the tools to the staff to speak up and to address that, and don't let it slide, right? And I think it is important for settlement agencies in particular, because you are in this, you are the front line of newcomers, right? You are at that front line, and people do come with vulnerabilities, right? We know the vulnerability of newcomers, refugees, and non-status, and you are at the front line addressing those issues and those challenges. And so I know it's not easy, right? To explain to somebody, oh no, that's not good to say that, because the system of oppression is affecting you too, right? So, how do you connect the dot of the system of oppression? How? By, you expressing the view, you are entrenching that system of oppression that ultimately hurts yourself, right? That is hurting you, right? So I think it's important to continue that dialogue.
Thank you so much. And we do have one more question, and I hope it will leave us with some hope as we move into the last conversation and we leave this conversation. But before I do that, we have a comment. I am grateful for this series, and that the series are recorded so that we can share the valuable, insightful, critical information that is being shared. We can share with our colleagues and partners to inform the conversations that we are having about creating inclusive workplaces and community in Durham. And also a great points and explanations. Thank you so much. And the final question, Amy, that I have for you from one of our participants, or one of the participants, rather, is the percentage of Asian immigrants to Canada is significantly increasing compared to previous decades. And I will highlight, and also Amy highlighted, the vastness of, when we say Asian immigrants or Asian communities, the vast, I guess, makeup of that community. So can you share more about your hopes for how organizations might be responsive to this?
Yes. Of course, I always end in a hopeful, I like to. And the hope is actually, I see that more and more young people are engaged. I do. Like, Asha, I'm sure you've been, to me, you're very young. I mean, I see hope when I see you. I see hope when I see other, Black young leaders and activists, and I see hope when I see Asian young people, right? And similarly, in my line of work, when we have, volunteers coming and say, oh, I want to be engaged, I want to know, I want to see how I can help, right? That's where I see hope, even though I know, because of course, that there are people like me who are older who continue this, this fight. But I do see hope, because at the same time, while the challenge is grave, right? While white supremacy is definitely on the rise and very much condoned and supported by the system that we have, right? By the government, by the media, by the justice, policing, enforcement, and all that. At the same time, when I see there are people speaking up, there are countering voices, there are immediate reactions and responses, I see hope. In Ottawa, remember that young 21-year-old, Chinese, she looks Chinese to me, and she's probably Asian Canadian civil servant, took them to court, sue them. Those to me are not freedom. These are white supremacist, movement. That gives me hope. I'm sure at her personal risk, great risk, I'm sure she must have received tremendous amount of hate and trolls and all that online and attacks. But in spite of all that, she spoke up. She did not back down. So that's how I see hope. And and that comforts me to hope that all of us on the call here will continue to engage young people, right? Will continue to engage younger generation, be it in your own family or beyond, to fight this fight, right? And that would be, I think, I hope the parting, sort of like message, because there is hope. There is, people in solidarity that are interested to do something and are working on it.
Thank you so much, Amy. I love what you leave us with, and I think I can only smile and just be thankful and extend gratitude for your time with us here and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And I do want to say that in the sake of time, 11:52, we are making great time. I want to say the closing remarks and then just leave the space if there are any other comments or questions for folks. So I do want to thank OCASI for organizing this webinar series. And thank you to each and every one of you who participated in today's session, including the interpreters and translators. Thank you to you, Amy Go, and I don't know if I've thanked you enough today for your insights and guidance. And of course, you can learn more about Amy. I do have that information for you. I will post it in the chat. I'm sure by searching her name on Google or when I can find that link, I will share it. But for any questions related to the presentation, any further questions, please contact OCASI. And we do have a few minutes. Amy, is there anything else you'd like to share with the participants before we part ways, or if the participants would like to share anything with Amy?
I really just truly grateful and thankful to OCASI for allowing me to share my thoughts, and really another learning opportunity, because I do keep track of the track here and the chat here, and really immensely grateful. And Asha, for your very, very skillful facilitation, and learned so much from you too, and also for your commitment. And I will continue to do the best that I can, and I look forward to continue working with all of you, not just OCASI, to advance and to combat racism, period. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And to the participants, again, thank you so much for your kind words. We really appreciate you all for showing up. This would not be possible without each and every one of you, and that stands true. So feel free to exit the call whenever you're ready. Interpreters, again, thank you all so much for your support. We will hang out for the 5 minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to stay on.